Hello, my name is Blake, and the claim I'm referring to is spanking is ultimately ineffective and it still has a negative impact on children. He has 4 secondary claims. 1, spanking a child will only stop the child from misbehaving momentarily. 2, spanking mentally scars the human mind. 3, not only does spanking cause harm mentally, it causes physical harm as well. And 4, that there have been alternative methods that have been proven to be more effective than spanking. My response to secondary claim number 1, which is spanking a child will only stop the child from misbehaving momentarily, is a quote from Neil Coughlin that says, in the modern world, corporal punishment has been made illegal in many European countries, including the UK. If you look at teenagers today, they are becoming more and more daring and rebellious and violent. There is more violence on today's streets than ever before because corporal punishment is not used. Children need to be clear about what is correct and incorrect behavior from an early age. Now this is showing that although spanking may temporarily stop misbehavior, it is better than doing nothing at all and misbehavior continuing. My response to secondary claim number 2, which is spanking mentally scars the human mind, is there is a whole other group. This is a quote from his claim is, there is a whole other group of parents who rationalize spanking by referring to the spankings they received as children from their own parents. If they turned out just fine even with spanking, then why wouldn't their children? He follows his quote with saying that this quote alone should be enough to support his claim, and I just do not see the reasoning behind it. Just because someone got spanked and turned out fine, so they believe that if they spank their kids, they too will turn out fine. How does this support that advocates claim that spanking is ineffective and has a negative impact? This is another quote from Neil Coughlin that says, many people who were hit as the children go on to achieve a lot in their life. In fact, this treatment may have even helped them to be successful. It can be a good way to teach discipline. This is the exact opposite of what the advocate claims. This is saying that spanking could benefit the person, making them who they are and giving them character. My response to his 3rd claim, which is not only does spanking cause harm mentally, it causes physical harm as well. The advocate claims that there are studies that show spanking being linked to physical abuse. One study at the University of North Carolina shows spanking most likely leads to higher forms of punishment. Such punishments may include beating, burning, kicking, hitting with an object. I found a quote from Zoltar that says, recent surveys show that up to 90% of children between ages 3 and 5 years are spanked by their parents at least occasionally. Zoder and his co-authors conducted an anonymous telephone survey on parenting of a probability sample of 1,400 mothers in North Carolina and South Carolina in 2002. 45% of the mothers reported that either they or their partner spanked their child in the previous 12 months, and 25% reported spanking with an object. 4% reported using harsher forms of punishment that met the study's definition of physical abuse. That came from Rick Nord. This shows that these studies are true from children from North and South Carolina, but we should refrain from generalizing that all children from every state who are being spanked are also being physically abused. This quote, according to National Institute of Healthcare Research, more than 80% of the professional publications attacking spanking were reviews and commentaries rather than quantitative research. When analyzing the small portion of quantitative studies that included spanking, more than 90% of these studies lumped together mild forms of spanking with severe forms of physical abuse without discussing why they did so. Thus, the professional organizations which advocated outlawing spanking evidently made their decisions without the benefit of facts. Mild spanking and severe child abuse are not the same thing. That came from Rocky Mountain Family Council. Basically, some of the reports were opinions rather than facts, and they included mild spanking as severe physical abuse with no justification as to why they did so. And my response to his last claim, which is there have been alternative methods that have been proven to be more effective than spanking. The advocate says, instead of trying to teach your children through fear and pain, you can use less violent methods such as timeouts. So this claim, I don't believe, is a claim of fact, but rather a claim of policy, saying we should use alternative methods of discipline since they are more effective. It claims that there are other forms of punishment are more effective, but it fails to prove that spanking itself is ineffective. Thank you.
All right, the labeling of the claims is fine. Your response on the first point seems to basically be that there's no correlation, or I should say that there is this correlation to some long-term consequences from failing to spank, and I think that's an interesting perspective to have. I do think it seems very conclusionary. The data there is a little skimpy. They're certainly making a big inference. But your argument in the long run says that, well, the temporary relief is better than no relief on that point, and I guess that's reasonable. You have to look at whatever the context of the spanking is, I suppose. The transition to the second point is pretty clearly explained. There's a contradictory claim on that point also, and there's some evidence on that particular point that I thought was okay. The third point, it's interesting because I think you're making a different inference from the evidence than I would have. Basically, it's about the link to the physical abuse, and 90% of the people engaged in this kind of spanking, but is it equivalent to physical abuse? Your basic argument is that we could only use this to read about North and South Carolina. We shouldn't be generalizing across the board, but I think you ought to be looking at, look, 90% of 3 to 5-year-olds have received some kind of spanking. Does that mean that 90% of those 3 to 5-year-olds have been physically abused as a consequence? Do we have any data that suggests that? I think that's the shoe that hasn't dropped, and that's the argument that you ought to be making on that point. I did think that you had a good challenge on the next part about the researchers who have basically they've committed a fallacy, and you ought to be pointing it out. They've equivocated spanking or mild spanking with abuse, and your argument that they are not in fact the same thing needs a little bit more explanation, but basically it's a reason to reject the inference from the research that's being presented. And your analysis of the alternatives is okay. You're right, it doesn't necessarily prove that spanking is problematic. I'm not sure that it is a negative consequence, but for instance, if you could show that it was substantially more effective, then maybe it would be something that would be reflecting negatively on spanking. But I don't remember that there was data on it that showed that it was substantially more effective. All right, thank you.